The frozen breath escaped Marcus's lips as he stared at the rusted metal door embedded in the Icelandic permafrost. Its surface covered in warnings written in 3 languages he couldn't read. But he could read the dates etched into the corroded steel 1962 to 1987. Cold War era. The Geiger counter in his backpack had been clicking steadily for the past 10 minutes, and now as he approached the sealed entrance, the clicks accelerated into an urgent metallic heartbeat. Something was moving behind the door, not the settling of old metal or the whisper of Arctic wind through cracks. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like breathing, but too slow, too deep for any human lung. Marcus pressed his ear against the freezing steel and immediately jerked back. The metal was warm to the touch, impossibly warm in the sub-zero temperatures that had claimed 3 of his fingers to frostbite just last winter. The expedition journals scattered around the entrance told a story he wasn't prepared for. Soviet research station abandoned during the final years of the Cold War. Biological experiments. Code names that made his blood run colder than the Arctic air. Project Metamorphosis. Subject Zero. The Sleeper Protocols. And now, 37 years later, something inside was still alive. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Before we dive into this nightmare that happened to my friend Marcus during his geological survey in remote Iceland, I need to ask, where are you watching this from? Because after you hear what he found in that bunker, you might want to check your locks tonight. If this story sends chills down your spine, smash that like button, subscribe for more true horror stories, and let me know in the comments if you've ever discovered something you wish you hadn't. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end for the twist that kept Marcus awake for months. Dr. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years studying permafrost samples across the Arctic Circle, but Iceland's Vatnajökull glacier region offered something unique. Layers of ice that preserved atmospheric conditions dating back millennia. His research focused on climate change indicators, examining how rapidly the permafrost was melting and what ancient materials were being released into the environment. The isolated research station he'd established sat 43 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by snowmobile during the brief summer months. Marcus preferred the solitude. After his divorce 2 years prior, the endless white expanse and howling winds provided the kind of peace that bustling university campuses couldn't offer. His days followed a rigid schedule: core sampling at dawn, laboratory analysis through the afternoon, and satellite communications with his research team in Reykjavik each evening at precisely 1900 hours. The landscape around his temporary base was deceptively serene. Rolling hills of pristine snow stretched toward jagged volcanic peaks, while the glacier's ancient ice reflected aurora borealis during the long winter nights. Local Icelandic guides had warned him about the area. Too many researchers had gone missing over the decades, they claimed. Old superstitions about cursed ground and restless spirits. Marcus dismissed such folklore as cultural remnants designed to keep outsiders away from valuable fishing and hunting territories. But there were signs, subtle ones, that his scientific mind couldn't quite categorize. Wildlife avoided the region entirely. No Arctic foxes, no bird migrations, not even the hardy ravens that typically scavenged near human settlements. The silence was absolute, broken only by wind and the occasional rumble of shifting ice. His equipment registered unusual electromagnetic readings, not strong enough to indicate mineral deposits, but persistent enough to interfere with radio communications. Most disturbing were the dreams. Every night since establishing the research station, Marcus experienced vivid nightmares of walking through endless underground corridors filled with the sound of breathing that wasn't quite human. He attributed this to isolation-induced psychological stress, a common occurrence among solo Arctic researchers. The human mind, deprived of social interaction, often manufactured its own stimulation through hyperactive dream states. 3 weeks into his planned 2-month expedition, Marcus discovered the first anomaly while conducting routine core sampling 2 kilometers northeast of his base station. The ice drill broke through into an air pocket. Unusual, but not unprecedented. However, the air that escaped carried a metallic scent mixed with something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in a warm room. The cavity beneath the ice was larger than his equipment could measure. Marcus lowered a waterproof camera attached to a climbing rope, watching the footage on his tablet as the lens descended through darkness. At 40 feet, the camera's LED illumination revealed worked stone. Not natural ice formations, but deliberately carved walls covered in what appeared to be Cyrillic inscriptions. This was impossible. His geological surveys indicated solid permafrost extending down 200 feet. There should be no structures, no cavities, nothing but frozen earth compressed over thousands of years. Yet the camera continued descending, revealing a constructed tunnel that extended beyond the reach of his rope. Marcus spent the next 2 days expanding the opening using heated water and careful excavation to create a passage large enough for human entry. The work was exhausting in the sub-zero temperatures, but his scientific curiosity overrode practical concerns about safety protocols. Solo researchers weren't supposed to explore unknown underground structures without backup support, but satellite communication with his university had been intermittent for days. On the third day, he finally descended into the tunnel. The construction was distinctly Soviet. Reinforced concrete walls, industrial lighting fixtures long since dead, and ventilation systems designed for long-term human habitation. Emergency signage in Russian marked escape routes and radiation protocols. This wasn't a natural formation or ancient archaeological site. This was a military installation buried beneath the ice for decades. His Geiger counter registered elevated but not dangerous radiation levels as he explored the main corridor. The facility extended much deeper than he'd anticipated, with multiple levels connected by metal staircases that echoed his footsteps into the darkness below. Emergency lighting systems remained partially functional, casting intermittent red illumination that created shifting shadows along the walls. The first laboratory he discovered contained equipment he recognized: centrifuges, microscopes, containment units designed for biological specimens. But the specimens themselves were gone, leaving only stains on metal tables and the lingering odor of preservative chemicals mixed with decay. Research notes scattered across workstations detailed experiments involving adaptive physiological modifications and enhanced survival protocols for extreme environments. Most disturbing were the photographs pinned to bulletin boards throughout the laboratory. Black and white images showing human subjects in various stages of what appeared to be biological transformation. The subjects' faces were obscured, but their body structures seemed wrong somehow. Elongated limbs, enlarged torso, cavities, fingers that extended far beyond normal human proportions. Marcus photographed everything his camera flash, illuminating details that the emergency lighting couldn't reveal clearly. In one image, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The transformation subjects weren't restrained. They appeared to be willing participants standing calmly while technicians measured their altered physiology. Their eyes, even in the grainy photographs, held an intelligence that was distinctly non-human. At the laboratory's far end, a heavy steel door marked "Containment Level, Authorized Personnel Only," stood partially open. The lock mechanism had been destroyed from the inside, metal twisted outward as if something incredibly strong had forced its way out. Beyond the doorway, darkness extended deeper into the facility, and from somewhere in that darkness came the sound he'd been hearing in his dreams. Breathing. Slow, rhythmic, patient. Something was still alive down there. Marcus should have left immediately. Every scientific protocol, every safety regulation demanded immediate evacuation and communication with authorities. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into the facility, compelled by a mixture of professional curiosity and something else. A growing certainty that this discovery would reshape everything he thought he knew about Cold War history and biological research. The containment level consisted of a series of holding cells, each equipped with observation windows and life support systems that still hummed with electrical power. Most cells were empty, their doors standing open, but several contained evidence of recent habitation. Not human habitation. The waste matter and scratch marks on the walls suggested occupants with very different physiological needs. His camera documented everything: feeding mechanisms designed to deliver liquid nutrients, temperature controls, maintaining environments far warmer than the surrounding permafrost, and monitoring equipment that tracked vital signs for occupants with heart rates significantly slower than human normal. One cell contained what appeared to be molted skin, translucent sheets of tissue that resembled human epidermis, but with a texture more similar to snake scales. The breathing sounds grew stronger as he progressed deeper into the facility. Whatever was generating those sounds was large, and it was moving. Marcus could hear the scrape of something heavy being dragged across concrete floors, accompanied by wet sliding noises that defied identification. His rational mind supplied explanations. Settling foundations, water drainage equipment malfunctions. But his instincts screamed warnings he couldn't ignore. In the facility's deepest accessible level, Marcus discovered the primary research archive. Thousands of documents preserved in climate-controlled filing cabinets detailed a project that operated from 1962 to 1987 under the code name Arctic Genesis. The research focused on adapting human physiology for survival in extreme environments, with Iceland serving as the primary testing facility due to its remote location and geological stability. The initial experiments involved voluntary subjects, Soviet military personnel who underwent surgical and chemical modifications designed to enhance cold weather survival. Early results showed promise subjects could maintain core body temperature in sub-zero environments, required significantly less food and water, and demonstrated enhanced healing capabilities. But the research progressed beyond simple environmental adaptation. Later documents described subjects who no longer required traditional food sources, instead absorbing nutrients directly from organic matter through specialized digestive modifications. Sleep cycles extended to weeks or months of dormancy, followed by brief periods of intense activity. Most significantly, brain scans revealed neural development patterns that suggested enhanced cognitive capabilities alongside diminished emotional responses. The project's final reports, dated December 1987, described a critical containment failure that resulted in facility evacuation. Several test subjects had refused termination protocols and demonstrated unprecedented adaptive behaviors that posed unacceptable security risks to operational personnel. The facility was sealed with subjects still inside, classified indefinitely, and abandoned to the permafrost. But the breathing sounds meant someone, or something, had survived 40 years in isolation. Marcus discovered the facility's monitoring station, where banks of screens displayed feeds from security cameras throughout the complex. Most cameras showed empty corridors and abandoned laboratories, but 3 screens in the lower levels revealed movement. Dark shapes that seemed too large to be human moved through the shadows, sometimes pausing directly in front of cameras as if aware they were being observed. The shapes had recognizable human characteristics: bipedal locomotion, manipulative appendages, cranial structures. But the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin in some areas, and too broad in others, moving with a fluid grace that suggested fundamental changes to skeletal and muscular systems. One shape moved closer to its camera, and Marcus found himself staring into eyes that retained human intelligence, despite pupils that had adapted to complete darkness. The creature's mouth opened, revealing dental modifications that combined human teeth with something more predatory, and it spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Dr. Chen, we've been waiting for you to find us." The voice came through the facility's intercom system, calm and patient, despite decades of isolation. Other voices joined it, creating a chorus of modified humans who had somehow survived 4 decades in this frozen tomb. They knew his name. They had been tracking his research activities, and they had been deliberately drawing him to this place. Marcus ran toward the exit, but the facility's layout had somehow changed. Corridors that led upward now descended deeper into darkness. Emergency lighting systems activated throughout the complex, illuminating his retreat, while simultaneously revealing how many of them were moving through the facility. The security cameras showed dozens of modified humans emerging from areas he hadn't explored, all moving with coordinated purpose toward his location. The breathing sounds were coming from everywhere now. Marcus reached the main laboratory level and discovered his path to the surface blocked by 3 of the modified humans. In the harsh emergency lighting, he could see the full extent of their transformation. Their skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality that revealed the slow circulation of blood through enlarged vessels. Limbs had been lengthened through surgical intervention, creating a spider-like grace in their movements. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways human vocal cords couldn't achieve. "You're afraid," the center figure observed, tilting its head with curiosity rather than malice. "We remember fear. It was inefficient, so we learned to process it differently." Marcus pressed himself against the laboratory wall, his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The facility's heating systems had shut down, and the temperature was dropping rapidly toward the outside permafrost levels. His exposed skin began numbing within minutes. "The cold doesn't affect you anymore," he managed to say through chattering teeth. "Cold, heat, pain, hunger, sleep." The creature's voice held a note of something that might have been nostalgia. "We adapted beyond the need for such limitations. The researchers thought they were creating better soldiers. Instead, they created something better than human." The other modified humans moved closer, and Marcus could see that each had undergone different modifications. One possessed elongated fingers that ended in hardened points capable of penetrating metal. Another had developed additional limbs that emerged from modified shoulder structures. The third showed signs of cranial expansion, suggesting enhanced brain capacity, and when it spoke, its voice carried an unusual harmonic resonance. "We survived by entering deep hibernation," the enhanced one explained. "Metabolism reduced to near-death levels, consciousness maintained at minimum necessary functions. We have been dreaming for 37 years, sharing experiences through neural modifications that link our consciousness. Your research activities disturbed our rest. We decided it was time to wake." Marcus realized the breathing sounds he'd been hearing weren't from a single creature. The modified humans synchronized their respiratory functions during hibernation, creating a collective life support system that had sustained them through decades of isolation. They had evolved beyond individual survival into something resembling a collective organism. "What do you want?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Evolution doesn't end with us," the first creature replied. "We need genetic diversity for the next phase, fresh biological material. You'll help us adapt these modifications for the changing climate conditions." They showed him to a prepared medical bay where surgical equipment had been maintained in perfect condition despite decades of abandonment. The modifications wouldn't kill him, they explained. Instead, he would become part of their collective consciousness while retaining his scientific knowledge and research capabilities. Together, they would emerge from the facility and establish new populations adapted for the increasingly unstable climate conditions affecting the planet. Marcus looked at the surgical table and understood that this had been planned from the moment he established his research station. They had been monitoring his communications, guiding his discovery of the facility, ensuring he would descend alone without backup support. His isolation wasn't coincidental. It was orchestrated. But as the modified humans prepared their equipment, Marcus noticed something they had overlooked in their decades of hibernation. The facility's nuclear power source, which had sustained their life support systems, was approaching critical failure. Radiation levels throughout the complex were rising steadily, and the containment systems showed signs of imminent breach. The creatures had survived 40 years of isolation, but they wouldn't survive the next 40 hours. Marcus pointed out the radiation readings to his captors, expecting them to panic, or at least show concern. Instead, they examined the data with the same calm intelligence they had demonstrated throughout the encounter. "We know," the enhanced one said simply. "Radiation exposure was part of the original modification process. We've adapted to levels that would be lethal to unmodified humans." But as Marcus studied the readouts more carefully, he realized the situation was more complex than they understood. The reactor wasn't simply failing. It was approaching a cascade failure that would contaminate hundreds of square kilometers of Icelandic wilderness. The creatures' collective hibernation had allowed them to survive normal background radiation, but they hadn't anticipated the exponential increase that preceded total containment breach. "You need to evacuate," Marcus told them. "This facility will be uninhabitable within hours." The modified humans exchanged glances that conveyed complex communication through barely perceptible changes in posture and expression. Their collective consciousness allowed them to process the information faster than individual minds could manage. "Then we leave together," they decided. "The surface world has changed since 1987. We'll need your knowledge to navigate the new environment." Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of helping his former captors prepare for evacuation while simultaneously planning his own escape. The creatures gathered essential research materials and biological samples they would need to establish themselves in the outside world. Their movements were efficient and coordinated, suggesting they had anticipated this possibility for years. As they ascended toward the surface through passages Marcus now realized the creatures had modified during their hibernation, he noticed signs of their long-term adaptation to the facility. The walls showed evidence of organic secretions that had reinforced the concrete structures. Ventilation systems had been enhanced with biological filters that processed air more efficiently than mechanical alternatives. The creatures weren't just surviving in the facility. They had been transforming it into something more suitable for their modified physiology. At the surface level, Marcus watched them emerge into the Arctic night with an anticipation that seemed almost childlike despite their horrific appearance. 40 years of artificial illumination and recycled air had left them eager to experience natural environmental conditions again. But something was wrong with their emergence into the outside world. The modified humans collapsed within minutes of reaching the surface. Marcus watched in fascination and horror as their bodies convulsed in the natural Arctic air. The atmospheric conditions that had sustained them through hibernation were artificial. Carefully controlled temperature, humidity, and gas mixtures that bore little resemblance to the actual environment above ground. They had adapted so thoroughly to their underground habitat that the surface world had become as lethal to them as their underground world would be to unmodified humans. Their enhanced physiology, designed for survival in extreme conditions, couldn't process the natural atmospheric gases and temperature variations they encountered outside the facility. Within an hour, all three creatures had died, their bodies already beginning to decompose at an accelerated rate that suggested their modified metabolisms couldn't maintain stability without the facility's life support systems. Marcus stood alone in the Arctic night, surrounded by the dissolving remains of humanity's most successful biological adaptation experiment. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt profound sadness for beings who had sacrificed their humanity only to discover they could never return to the human world. He gathered the research materials they had brought to the surface and began the long journey back to his research station. The facility's nuclear reactor would breach within hours, contaminating the site and ensuring no one could follow his path to discover what lay beneath the permafrost. But as Marcus reached his research station and prepared to contact authorities about the radiation hazard, he discovered something that changed everything he thought he understood about his experience. The satellite communication logs showed no incoming messages for the past 3 weeks. His scheduled check-ins with the university had been automatically acknowledged by a system that was responding to signals from inside the facility, not from his research station. Every conversation he thought he'd had with his research team had actually been generated by the facility's AI systems, which had been maintaining the illusion of normal communication to keep him isolated and focused on his discoveries. More disturbing, his own research notes from the past month showed handwriting that wasn't entirely his own. The modifications to his investigative procedures, the changes in his sampling locations, the gradual shift in his research focus toward the area where he discovered the facility, all had been influenced by subliminal suggestions transmitted through his communication equipment. The creatures in the facility hadn't been waiting for him to find them. They had been guiding him to discover them from the moment he arrived in Iceland. And the most terrifying realization came when Marcus examined his reflection in the research station's mirror. His pupils had begun adapting to low-light conditions. His breathing had slowed to match the rhythmic pattern he'd heard in the facility. The skin on his hands showed the early stages of the translucent quality he'd observed in the modified humans. The surgical modifications hadn't been performed in the facility's medical bay. They had been administered gradually through his food supply, his breathing apparatus, his daily exposure to contaminated equipment. The creatures hadn't captured him to transform him. They had been transforming him from the moment he established his research station. Marcus was already becoming one of them. As he stared at his changing reflection, he realized the facility's reactor breach wasn't an accident. It was a planned decontamination protocol designed to eliminate evidence of the failed experiment. But the experiment hadn't failed. It had simply moved to a new location. The research station's radio crackled to life with an incoming message from the university asking about his scheduled return to civilization. Marcus reached for the microphone and heard his own voice respond with words he hadn't consciously chosen to speak. Research proceeding on schedule, requesting extension for additional sample collection. Will maintain radio silence for next 2 weeks. His modified physiology was already adapting to surface conditions better than the original test subjects. Soon, he would be ready to return to populated areas carrying the biological modifications that would allow the next phase of human evolution to begin. The Arctic Genesis project hadn't ended in 1987. It had just been waiting for the right vector to carry it into the modern world.